and welcome to Ye Olde Bestsellers Book Club, where I am reading through some of America's earliest best-selling novels, as reported by The Bookman, a literary magazine of the 1890s. Today's book is The One Woman by Thomas Dixon, Jr. Dixon was a lot of things. A preacher, briefly a lawyer and a politician, a failed actor, a playwright, a novelist, and, as some have labeled him, a professional racist. 2 years after publishing The One Woman, he put out a novel called The Klansman, a historical romance of the Ku Klux Klan, which he later adapted into a stage play, later adapted into the quite controversial silent film Birth of a Nation. This is a man who says that his most vivid childhood memory is watching the Klan parading through the streets of his hometown and being told by his mother that they're there to protect him. He had some opinions. Lots of them, actually. The One Woman is not one of his books about race, but it covers a lot of his other, also very questionable thoughts. But we will get to those as we go along. So, our protagonist for this novel is Reverend Frank Gordon. He's a tall, handsome, athletic, 30-something man with flowing locks of blonde Prince Charming hair and very big, veiny, bare hands. The author simply cannot stop talking about Frank's, quote, great, hairy, blue-veined hands, end quote. It starts on page 5, and it does not stop. There are 27 total references in this book to the appearance of Frank's hands. They are big, blue-veined, hairy, bear-like, muscular, enormous, great, broad, and powerful, and often several of those things at once. Frank's wife, similarly, has constantly tapering fingers, as stated 12 times. Now, our story opens on one of Frank's sermons. He's a very talented speaker, very eloquent, very emotional. Quote, "The church was packed that night with more than 2,000 people. The air was hot and foul. The ushers were so used to people fainting that they kept water and smelling salts handy in the anterooms. The Reverend Frank Gordon no longer paused or noticed these interruptions. He had accepted the truth that while God builds the churches, the devil gets the job to heat, light, and ventilate them." End quote. After the service, a young woman named Kate Ransom comes to see him in his private study to thank him for his wonderful sermons and all the good they've done her, and to apologize if she interrupted him by fainting mid-service, which he did not even notice. Frank is very struck by Kate's beauty. She's full-figured, violet-eyed, with hair that looks brown until the light shines through its deep red undertones. Quote, "Her gait was proud and careless, telling of perfect health and stores of untouched vital powers." End quote. That is another weird physical description theme. So often when Frank is thinking about how hot a woman is, it's due to her deep stores of untapped health or vitality or her walk. Or both. Sometimes her bosom heaving as she breathes, but I have never seen someone get their motor running so hard over the way a lady walks. Just as Kate leaves his study, Frank's wife Ruth comes in, immediately very jealous. And we now descend into multiple pages of truly exhausting marital bickering. Ruth has been nagging him a lot lately about his politics and the way he's treating religion. He's preaching Christian socialism, treating the Bible as mere literature. He admits that he doesn't even always preach from the Bible anymore, quote, "except as its truth had passed into my own soul's experiences," end quote. Ruth also just will not stop going on about that pretty woman that was in your office, Frank. Oh, that pretty woman. All these women are just so in love with your stupid pretty hair, Frank. I think you may be starting to find marriage wanting. Meanwhile, Frank pleads that he's just so exhausted from work, he's all grumpy, he's been criticized in the newspaper recently, and he's so sensitive to that kind of thing. And even worse, at a recent trustee meeting, no one on the church board was interested in his plan to build a massive, super ostentatious marble megachurch. Though, not because he already has a church, and his plan would be super expensive. No, the trustees weren't on board because it would draw too many crowds of commoners. And, quote, "we don't want such trash elbowing our old parishioners out of their pews," end quote. Eventually, Frank gets tired of arguing and declares they will, quote, "spend the night under different roofs," end quote, and storms out, leaving Ruth in a terrified panic. By 1 o'clock that night, he is still not home, and she has collapsed to her knees, worried that he could have been, quote, stricken suddenly with mortal illness, end quote, crying incoherently on the floor, proclaiming to God that she'll die if he doesn't come home soon. Meanwhile, Frank has just been hanging out for hours, thinking a little bit about Ruth, and a little bit about Kate, and a lot about the super expensive church that he wants to build, before he remembers that he actually loves his wife, and he rushes home. Ruth hurls herself at him the moment he is through the door, pleading for forgiveness, calling herself selfish and fretful and willful, while he soothed her as a child. So many of these old books are constantly finding ways to call the woman love interests childlike for a variety of different reasons. It feels gross and infantilizing every time. The next day, Frank goes to visit his dearest friend and old college pal, Mark Overman, who despises women and loves cocks. By which I mean roosters. He is very into cockfighting. Overman is 40, single, disgustingly rich, and phenomenally ugly, witty, well-read, and quite cynical. And he doesn't allow women onto his property at all, even as staff. He is also a fierce critic of Frank's recent socialism. Quote, "It makes a man flabby. It is the earmark of racial degeneracy. The philanthropist bitten by it from just a plain fool develops a madman, while the home builder turns free lover and rake under its teachings. Socialism is the return to the animal herd, and the family will be trampled to death beneath its hooves," end quote. He accuses Frank of not actually knowing enough about the ideology, and so starts pulling socialist books off his library shelves and reading quotes that suggest horrible things, like marriage should be created on a, quote, basis not of a predetermined lifelong business arrangement to be formally held to irrespective of conditions, but on mutual inclination and affection, an association terminable at the will of either party, end quote. Or, quote, "In a socialist form of government, the sex relation would vary according to the feelings and wants of individuals," end quote. Oh, the horror! Someone fetch my fainting couch. He argues that socialism equals no private property equals the death of monogamy because the family is the source of possessive monopolistic instinct, and this inherent attack on the foundations of family is why, quote, "socialism never converts a woman except through some individual man. Woman's maternal instinct created monogamic marriage. The only women who become socialists directly are the sexless, the defectives, and the oversexed," end quote. So, socialism turns you into a rakish free lover, but being promiscuous makes women turn socialist, so they both cause each other, I guess, but also if you're too sexless, that can also, unless you're a man, in which case I guess you're just always susceptible. Frank thinks Overman is being dumb and ignores him completely. Kate Ransom starts to get very involved in Frank's church. She's great at organizing things and bringing people together. She's quite wealthy and sort of out of touch, but working with Frank opens her eyes to the suffering and poverty of the city. She feels like she's seeing New York for the first time, and she's inspired to throw herself into charity for the local community. For the first time in life, she has a purpose, and it's all thanks to Frank. Over the course of a year, they get quite close, sometimes blatantly flirtatious. Frank leers at her beautiful figure and wishes his wife was so involved and interested in his work. Quote, "To the woman, the man had become little less than her god. For the man, this fair woman, beautiful and loyal in the worship of his strength, as the soul of the strong man ever desires of his ideal woman, she had become his daily inspiration," end quote. I'm gonna yak. His wife Ruth, meanwhile, has given up on everything in her life but their children. She no longer comes to the church. She and Frank barely speak. Now, Frank made a whole dramatic-ass speech at the church board back before this year-long time skip about how he was going to build his marble monster church with or without their help. He'll finance it independently if he has to. And then he seems to have made no effort to fulfill that promise, not even, planning or anything, for the entire year. But now, he finally gets around to it. In a very special, very intense sermon, he begs the public to help fund his dream. And it's going well, some people are in tears, and then they start laughing. Because there is a cat sitting up on the pulpit behind him, and the cat says, and I quote, Meow. And then the sickening certainty crushed him that the day was lost, that it was beyond the power of human genius or the reach of the Spirit of God to remove that cat and regain control of his audience. He turned sick with anger and humiliation, and his big, bear-like hands clasped his sheet of notes and slowly crushed them. End quote. This is my favorite scene in the whole book. He tries to catch the cat. This doesn't work and only makes things worse. Just pat her on the head and move on, Frank. Someone else catches her, it's fine. But Frank gets very dramatic. He tells everyone that his church board nemesis must have placed the cat in the church as an act of sabotage, which would be the dumbest sabotage attempt imaginable. There would be no way to guarantee that this cat wouldn't just hang out in a quiet corner somewhere, licking her crotch and distracting no one. It's a cat. He then starts tearing apart the pulpit, throwing things, ripping his robe off his body, shedding the trappings of the modern church, before launching into a speech rejecting traditionalism and modern Christianity, which fears progress and misunderstands the plight of the masses. But he is going to start his own church, a better church, but he needs your help. Please fund Frank's dream of solving poverty by building a massive marble building. Yeah, I feel like, charity might be a better. Anyway, cards are handed out to the crowd so they can write in their donations, and once these have all been recollected, Frank takes them back to his study to count them. He thinks he'll need at least $1 million to fund the construction. He received only $20,000. However, most of the people who come into his church are those not well off. Those are the type of people his politics appeal to, the common man. I'm surprised he got even $20,000. With an inflation calculator, that came out to over $500,000 in modern-day value in one night from one room of people. It was stated earlier that his sermons reach millions through the press. Surely some of them would be willing. And he personally reached out to multiple millionaires he has connections to. At least wait to hear back from them before giving up entirely. Fundraisers for massive projects don't have to be completed overnight. Host a charity dinner. Preach and beg in the streets. I don't know. You're asking for a today value of like $33 million. Have some patience. But no, his dreams have died in a single evening, and he sits at his desk moping. He's supposed to go see Kate, but instead he sends a note, quote, feeling too blue to call, failure complete and pitiful, end quote. But then a lawyer comes to see him with the news that a mysterious benefactor is gifting him with $1 million. Frank is, of course, overjoyed, and this good fortune fills him with gratitude for his heavenly Father. This renewal of faith makes him realize that he needs to be a better man. He needs to be true to the vows he took at the altar of marriage. He needs to tear the sin of Kate Ransom from his life. So he goes to Kate immediately and starts by confessing that he loves her. Quote, I have felt it growing in spite of reason or will, but God has sent his messenger today to recall me to duty. I must tear this passion out of my life, though it kill me. And you, my beautiful, darling, glorious love of my manhood, you must help me, end quote. And she agrees through sobs that they can never see each other again. And then they kiss, and now he's gonna leave. But on the way out, he sees a card for a lawyer. The same lawyer who just told him about the $1 million donation. So he confronts her, and she admits she is his mysterious benefactor, and far more wealthy than he realized. He says, in shock, quote, I have misread the message. Such love is in itself divine, and its own defense. You are mine by the higher law of life. I will not give you up. You are mine. Mine. I will defy the world. I will not live with one woman and love another, end quote. So he goes home to Ruth, says he's in love with Kate and can't bear to live a lie, so they'll have to divorce. Quote, she sank to the floor, buried her face in her arms, and stretched out her hand until her tapering fingers rested on his broad foot. He bent and took her hand as though to lift her. Suddenly the fever of her hot fingers, trembling with overpowering passion, and the tremor of her convulsed body swept his memory with the pain and rapture of his hour with Kate. Still holding her fingers, he slipped his watch from his pocket with the other hand and glanced quickly at its face to see if it were time for his return to the ransom house, and, quote, "Your wife is sobbing on the floor, and you are stopping to check your goddamn watch, Frank Gordon? Have, like, a shred of decency, maybe." He tells Ruth she's humiliating herself and making things so painful for him. She has to stop. She just begs him again and again to stay, say he loves her, even if it's a lie. Just don't go, but he says no and walks away from his house and his wife and his children. Ruth promises she'll tell the children he's just gone traveling, but he'll come back for them someday, and she'll teach them to love him always, which is just so much more than he deserves. Kate actually almost backs out for a second. She feels really guilty about doing this to Ruth, but not quite enough to actually stop. So she tries to make it better by offering her $500,000, which is like half of her remaining fortune. But Ruth refuses this sale of her husband, which you would be lucky to give Frank away, let alone sell him for what would today be worth like $16 million. Now, it does not take long for the press to find out this hot new gossip about everyone's favorite celebrity preacher, and Frank is heavily criticized. His defense is that, quote, "I propose to lead a crusade for the emancipation of women from the degradation of its slavery. Love bound in chains is not love," end quote, which, like, yeah, but the only person being emancipated right now is you, Frankie boy. Don't pretend you're doing this for the ladies. Frank's father reads about the divorce and assumes it must be some horrible made-up slander, so he rushes to New York to check on Frank and is very upset to hear that the rumors are, in fact, true. He tells Frank that, quote, "The man and woman whom God hath made one in the beat of a child's heart cannot get hopelessly apart. It's a physical and moral impossibility," end quote, but Frank cannot be convinced, so Dad goes to see Ruth, who he has always loved like a daughter, and he is sobbing all over the place, but says, "Don't worry, I am here to help you." He immediately contacts a lawyer to transfer his personal savings into her name and says he'll live nearby for the rest of his life, which he's not wrong, and it's a good thing he transferred the money so quickly. He is dead by morning of sadness and disappointment. He tells Frank, who comes to see him as he's dying, quote, "When I go from this lump of clay, if you will open my breast, you will find an old man's broken heart, and across the rent your name will be written in the ragged edges," end quote, which is brutal and poetic. But I feel like this was comically sudden. Could it not have taken, like, a week for him to die of a broken heart because of his son's divorce? This man's wife died in childbirth. I don't think this is the hardest thing he's gone through. And it's not like it had to happen quickly because of plot constraints. Next chapter, we time skip a year into the future when the divorce is made official. He had a whole year in which to die. But no, it took, like, 12 hours. A year later, Frank and Kate can now officially get married, and they have a very non-traditional ceremony surrounded by friends. There's a lot of emphasis on the fact that this is a freedom marriage. She doesn't promise to obey, she is his equal comrade, and they are bonded as one by pure divine love. Frank's religious beliefs have, at this point, veered fully off course. He declares sin an invention of the human mind. The real crime is denying human nature. Very hippie cult leader vibes. Meanwhile, Ruth is now on her own, and has made a mess of the family finances. But she is saved by an old flame of hers, Morris King. He is an attorney and a candidate for governor in an upcoming election. They had a casual but steady courtship when Ruth was a teenager. He actually took her to the ball where she first met Frank Gordon. She was immediately smitten with Frank, broke things off with Morris. He then considered drowning himself in the river, but decided that the water looked too cold and gross, so he went to New York instead. He's been single ever since and has never stopped loving Ruth, and for years has been her free on-call attorney. So when he hears about her struggling finances, he comes over and says, quote, "I have come back to take charge of your business, and you can't run me away with a stick," end quote. And then he proclaims his love, even as she begs him not to, and says that he is going to devote his life to serving and protecting her. that when Frank, quote, threw you from him as a cast-off garment, I would have killed him, but for the fierce joy that now I could win you, end quote. Okay, I'm on the side of anyone who isn't Frank, but let's calm down a little and maybe not talk about Ruth like she's a prize at the state fair. She, of course, turns Morris down because she still loves Frank. Frank and Kate settle into their new married life. She's spending more time throwing fabulous parties rather than working with him nowadays. Charity and community work seems to have gone out the window for both of them. He wants her to spend less time with her, quote, freelances and bohemians, end quote, and more courting his friends, some of whom still think he's crazy. Especially Mark Overman, lover of roosters, hater of women. Overman does not want to meet Kate. He literally tries to run away when he sees her. Frank has to physically restrain and threaten to sit on him. But the second she starts talking, her beauty turns him stupid, and he agrees to come to dinner. And then he cannot stop coming over for dinner. He and Frank like to sit around and debate, mostly more, is socialism bad, while Kate listens in, and she is very drawn to Overman. He's brilliant, witty, and fascinatingly ugly. Where Frank is an idealist, Overman is remorselessly logical, a contrast in every way. He is also a banker, and so they start involving him in their business side of things, and the construction of the marble monster church that Frank is still building. It's Kate's money, so everything is in her name, meaning she often has to come by the bank to sign legal documents, and then she and Overman will take a casual lunch alone together. He reveals to her the root of his woman problem. He doesn't really hate them. He's actually starved for love, but just deeply insecure and afraid because he's a hideous bullfrog given human form, which Kate reassures him is ridiculous. Women love a rugged man. Eventually, the Great Monster Church is finally finished, costing $2 million in loans on top of the original $1 million from Kate. It's huge, like 20 stories tall in most places, 30 in others, seats 5,000 in the auditorium, covered in Greek columns and bronze statues, marble everywhere, and, quote, from the center of this pile of marble, the huge dome, finished in gold, solemnly loomed among the clouds, higher than its model in Washington, dominating the city from every point of the compass, end quote. It's also not just a church, but office space for income. But think of all the people you could have actually helped with that much money. Frank, you used to care about charity. Helping people was like most of his job. We are now about 2 years into Frank and Kate's marriage, and things are starting to strain. The honeymoon phase is over. Frank isn't a god that she reveres, but a man, quote, self-conscious, egotistic, and domineering. He had many personal habits she did not like. He was over-fastidious in his dress and critical and fussy about her lack of order in housekeeping. He was finicky about his food. He hated tea, declaring the odor made him sick, end quote. He is getting very annoyed at how much she clearly likes Overman. She argues that he told her to spend less time with her bohemians and more time with his friends, but, quote, still, it is not necessary to hang on his words with such melting interest, end quote. There's other issues, too, lots of bickering. Now, Ruth, still making bad choices. She's been attending Frank's sermons for months. Her old flame Morris has won his election and become governor of New York, and he writes her a love letter every day. He is doing everything he can to wear her down, and it actually, slowly, almost starts working. She starts thinking maybe a life with Morris could be a natural fit, and this terrifies her, so she decides to run away to Florida for a couple weeks with her children for some distance. So they're on the train, they sit down in the dining car, and then Ruth's son exclaims, quote, look, Mama dear, look, it's Papa, end quote. Frank and Kate just so happened to be on this exact train. They actually got seated at the exact same table, by ridiculous coincidence. The children start sobbing. They haven't seen him in years. The adults are all blushing furiously. Ruth is honestly kind of happy about it, but Kate is pissed and storms out, and Frank follows, abandoning his children once again. Father of the Year. Kate accuses Frank of still being in love with Ruth, which nothing in that scene implied. Quote, "But don't flatter yourself I care or am jealous. You're not worth a moment's jealousy, you great hulking baby." End quote. I don't disagree with that. Also, the reason they're going to Florida is because Frank needed a break, and an excuse to get Kate away from Overman. Late that night, quote, "Suddenly Ruth was awakened by a sickening crash as though the earth had collided with a star and been crushed as an eggshell. The car seemed to leap 100 feet into the air, plunge through space, and strike the ground with a dull smash that sent dust and splinters flying through every inch of space. Now the car was plowing through the earth, now falling end over end. At last it stopped with a shivering crash." End quote. It's raining and windy, the train car is lying on its side and also on fire, but Ruth and the children are okay. The chances of bumping into your ex-husband on a train that crashes that night. Now, I cannot for the life of me figure out the physical configuration of this train wreck. It's not that important. I know that Ruth's car is on its side, teetering partially over an edge, like an embankment. But it's also resting on another car, and the windows of those two cars seem to align, and it is somewhere between 8 and 20 feet above rushing water, which is at the bottom of that embankment. Somewhere in the wreckage, a woman is screaming for help. Quote, "Rushing forward, still dragging the children, she found Kate pinned on her back, with the flames leaping closer each moment. Swiftly, the lithe form sprang to the rescue. She ran her hands over Kate's magnificent figure and tore her robes loose where it was pinioned between the timbers." End quote. Did we need to phrase it that way, author? Is now, in Ruth's point of view, under these circumstances, the time to lust after Kate's luscious curves? Were you worried we'd forget? This is like when Overman once referenced Frank's big blue-veined fist out loud in dialogue, as if that is a thing a human would say about their friend. As if the story will fall apart if we forget for 2 seconds about Frank's bulging veins. Frank is already down below by the river, so they break a window and jump one by one into the safety of his arms. Somehow, in the whole very dramatic-sounding wreck, 30 of the 50 total passengers were completely unharmed, and the other 20 were wounded, but none too seriously, which is just downright boring and implausible. But the threat of this mortal peril and the immediate aftermath rekindles some of Frank's feeling of connection with his family. As he and Kate ride a train back to New York, he finds himself captivated by thoughts of Ruth, wondering if their very souls haven't been intermingled over the birth of their children, in a bond that can't be broken. Meanwhile, Kate comes away from the ordeal in a crisis. She tells Frank that Ruth saved her life, and that, quote, "I've quite fallen in love with her. I've been sitting here for hours wondering at the meanness of a man who could desert her. Frank, I fear your spell over me is broken. I think I'll despise all men and love all women after today." End quote. Oh, if only. Neither of these changes of heart actually alter either of their behavior meaningfully. Frank muses about tender memories of life with Ruth, but simultaneously becomes ravenously lustful and possessive over Kate, as he feels her drifting further away, and she is still quite into Mark Overman. One Sunday morning, she invites him over while Frank is sermoning at the temple, and she puts on a gorgeous, filmy dress and confesses that she loves Overman and knows that he loves her. He is gasping for air, constantly eyeing the exit, hoping he might be able to make an escape, but eventually can't help but surrender. And she says that he is now her master, her king, her soul's mate. From this moment on, Frank will no longer be her husband. Overman asks if she's sure that she knows what that means. He isn't the sentimental fool that Frank is, always preaching about personal freedom. If they are together, Kate will be his, and she agrees she wants Overman to be her lord and master. 'Cause I guess if you allow your woman freedom of choice, her nature will force her to seek out a properly dominating man, or some such nonsense, as if Frank's issue is that he's not possessive enough, and not just that he's a prick. They plan to tell Frank and make arrangements later that day, but for now, Overman leaves. Enter Frank. He's done. He has had enough of Mark Overman in this house. Kate responds, quote, "Very well. This is my house. You know the way to the hotel, or shall I ring for my maid to show you?" End quote. She's a free woman who will do as she pleases and who she pleases. She says that she and Overman are now bound by the bonds of love and will be married. At which point Frank gets kinda scary. If domestic violence is not a thing that you're interested in hearing about, I'd skip a couple minutes here, maybe like 4.5. Frank says that he'll show her, quote, "if you really push me to it, what a return to the freedom of nature really means," end quote, and grabs her by the arm hard enough to leave marks, talking about how few men equal his strength, how, quote, "I feel throbbing in my veins today the blood of 1,000 savage ancestors who made love to their women with a club and dragged them to their caves by the hair," end quote. And he threatens to kill her and Overman if the man ever dares set foot in this house again. Which Overman does later that day, as he and Kate had planned. Frank sends Kate to her room, and he and Overman start with a fairly civil argument. Overman has been criticizing constantly the whole marriage based on freedom thing. He views the possibility of divorce as an inherent challenge. Earlier he said, quote, "You say to your wife and to the world, 'This peerless woman is my comrade, but she is free. Take her if you can,' end quote. Frank admits, quote, "I've been a fool. I know better now. I appeal to your sense of honor and our long friendship. Let us return to the old life and its standards. Then go back to the wife of your youth and the mother of your children," end quote. But no, Frank only wants to go back to the old ways starting right now. He is the only one who deserves the freedom of divorce on a whim, I guess. So much for the emancipation of women. He gives one final warning, quote, "Well, you who have never feared man, listen. Get out of this house tonight. Give up my wife, never speak to her again, or cross my path, or else. I am going to disarm you, bend your bulldog's body across my knee by an art of which I am master, close your jaw with this fist on your throat, and break your back inch by inch. Will you go?" End quote. I don't like the implication that Frank is a master of bending people across his knee. Where exactly have you been practicing that, sir? Overman stands his ground, and so Frank picks up 2 fancy knives, hands one to Overman, locks the doors, and switches off the lights to make things fair and honorable, because Overman is missing one eye, and Frank thinks the blind side would make him more vulnerable. And so the two stalk silently around the pitch-dark room, circling the edges, quote, now and then stumbling against a piece of furniture, end quote, but never meeting each other, until, quote, Gordon suddenly stopped, held his breath, and waited for the enemy to overtake him. He could hear Overman's heavy breathing at each muffled step. When he approached so close he could feel the movement of his body in the air, he suddenly sprang on him, plunging the dagger into his body, and bore him to the floor. Over and over on the velvet carpet they rolled, growling, snarling, cursing in low, half-articulate gasps, thrusting the steel into flesh and bone, nerve and vein and artery. End quote. Frank snaps his knife in Overman's body, and so stabbing turns to choking. And, quote, then slowly, silently, inch by inch, he bent the banker's body over his knee, driving his great fingers into his throat, until the spinal column snapped with a dull crack. The limp form sank to the floor, and the two big hands clutched the throat until every finger left its black print as if branded red-hot into the massive neck, end quote. And then Kate knocks on the door. Frank dumps the body behind a desk, which will not disguise the blood that is, I am sure, everywhere, and then lets Kate in, quietly locking the door behind her. Quote, she turned on him a face blanched with speechless horror as he slowly advanced on her in silence, his eyes wide open, cold and set. He came close, in labored breath, his face still sick and white with the desire to kill. Say your prayers, young woman. You are going on a long journey from whence no traveler has yet returned. End quote. Kate tries to plead, but Frank grabs both her wrists in one hand, quote, and with the other swept her magnificent hair around her throat, grasped it in his iron fist, and thus choking her, thrust the shivering figure backward into the chair. End quote. She manages to get somewhat free, says stop, she loves him, he can't do this, tries to smother him in kisses, but, quote, hush, he said softly, putting his big hand over her full lips. Why such childish terror? I'll go with you. Neither life nor death shall take you from me, end quote. And then Kate faints. And Frank has the sudden realization that, quote, I was the master of her heart and life. I could have made her anything, angel or devil, end quote. This is not the first time one of these books has specifically said that the man makes of his woman an angel or devil. When Knighthood Was in Flower said that too, in basically those terms. It's even weirder in this book because clearly Frank didn't have much corrupting power over Ruth. She once literally begged him to make her a socialist if he was so sure it was correct, because as her husband he promised to teach her and correct her if she was being foolish, but he never did change her. So why are Kate's life choices out of her control and his fault? He lays Kate down on the lounge, alive, packs a bag, and then, quote, an hour later he struggled and staggered up the hill through the black roaring storm and rang Ruth's doorbell, end quote. She opens the door to find her horribly blood-stained ex-husband, who admits that, in a rage, he has killed a man. And instead of doing anything reasonable, she kisses him, sobbing, and says, yes, of course she'll shelter him from the police. She loves him so much. Lucky for Frank, the snowstorm outside is fierce and holds up the police and most of the city in general for a while. But it's not going to be enough time for him to heal enough to go on the run. He is going to get caught eventually. He says, quote, I killed him in the heat of passion in a fight, but I'll be tried for murder, end quote. Frank, it was most definitely murder. You declared your intentions hours before it happened, repeatedly. You and Overman had a fairly calm, multi-page debate right before it happened, and then you decided, consciously, to stop talking, methodically lock the door, distribute weapons, and commence a duel. This wasn't the heat of passion. This was premeditated murder. Ruth is just beside herself, miserable at the thought that her poor ex-husband might face consequences for turning into a horror movie villain. He was so unsettling. Thankfully, he is arrested. A lot of the press is against him. Some people are sympathetic. The horrible socialists are just overjoyed that he killed a banker. But the people that Frank had helped and inspired during his good priest days are brought to tears, feeling sorry for Mr. Murder Man. Ruth visits him every day at the prison, bringing, quote, a message of courage and cheer, end quote. She becomes Frank's whole world. He sees how beautiful and marvelous she is, how she has never failed him, even when everyone else has. What a mistake he made leaving her. The trial starts, and Kate Ransom steps up to the witness stand. Her testimony is not entirely correct. She says that Overman was unarmed when he was killed, and Frank's own knife wounds were self-inflicted as part of that murder-suicide that he threatened. It's left uncertain whether she's lying intentionally to make him look worse, or if her memory and understanding is just understandably shaky, given what happened to her. Frank deserves it either way. On the day when the jury is finally sent out to deliberate, Ruth waits, and, quote, minutes lengthened into hours, hours into days and years, until time and eternity were one, and she lived a life of despair or hope within the second between the ticks of the clock on the wall, end quote. Then they return and declare, quote, guilty of murder in the first degree, end quote, and he gets sentenced to death. I wish I had confetti. Frank is beyond caring at this point. He has given up on life. But Ruth is determined to save him. She campaigns for a retrial, and because she's so pure and loving and wonderful, a lot of people actually end up on her side. Even the warden of the prison loves her so much that, quote, there was no favor within the limits of the law that he had not granted to the man she loved, end quote. That is corrupt at best. But Ruth's wish is granted. New trial. The big problem is Kate and her version of events. Ruth goes to see her and pleads that, quote, they fought a duel as men have often done. You were in a swoon. He did not hurt you, end quote. He choked her with her own hair and left bruises on her arm, at least. Ruth also tries to pull the "I saved you from the train crash, so don't desert me in my time of need" card, which I have had some sympathy for Ruth, even through her multiple bad decisions and endless forgiveness of an objectively bad man, but at this point she deserves her shitty husband that she is so desperate to keep. Kate responds, quote, "If it were your life, I'd save it if I swore 1,000 lies. But for him, the brute, you have not felt his hands on your throat." "No, not on my throat. It would have been a relief to have felt them there. They were on my soul. But I love him," end quote. Fortunately, the second trial goes the same as the first. Frank is undeniably guilty. Ruth only has one option left. She goes to see Morris, her once love, now governor of New York, to beg for a pardon, which is not a thing that he should be able to do. I don't know what the point is in a court of law if a murder charge can be completely overridden just because the governor is in love with some lady. He agrees only to grant a stay for 3 months, and while Ruth campaigns at him for that entire time, apparently nothing happens until the actual day of the execution arrives, for tension, I guess. At which point, Ruth goes to see Morris, and she takes her now teenage daughter Lucy. And when Morris lays eyes on her, all he can see is Ruth on that night so many years ago when he lost her to Frank Gordon. And this walking memory pleads to him, quote, "Save my father," end quote. He relents and orders a full pardon. However, there is another conveniently timed storm, and it's brought down the wires. They can't contact the prison. They have to rush there on a train, but the storm, oh no, there's wreckage on the tracks. Am I supposed to be hoping that they make it there on time? Should this be tense? It's just infuriating that Frank might live. Meanwhile, in prison, the warden is really dragging his feet, getting Frank to the death chair. He has such affection for Frank now. He feels he may as well be killing a brother. It's such a tragedy that this has to happen. Give me a break. But Frank is strapped into the chair, and just as the warden puts his hand on the switch, a guard frantically knocks at the door, announcing news from the governor. After serving just 3 years in prison during all of those trials, Frank Gordon is a free man. He and Ruth reunite as Morris holds back sobs, accepting his defeat before Ruth's pure and unyielding divine love of her terrible ex-husband. He has them remarried on the spot, and Lucy asks, quote, "May I kiss you, Governor? You are my hero." Her bare arms flashed around his neck, and her warm lips met his, end quote. She is a teenager who looks like the woman he has been in love with for like 2 decades, her mother. I don't like that. And then the very last paragraph of the book is a description of Morris sitting alone in his room at night, staring longingly at an old photograph of him and Ruth before she left him, and being sad about it. The end? Okay, look, I was on board with Frank's sudden turn from just terrible husband into genuinely unsettling, vicious murderer. I liked that sequence. I found it genuinely tense. The fight was decently written and brutal. I actually got invested. But how you write that descent into evil and madness and then turn around and treat Frank like a sympathetic, gentle-at-heart man who was just corrupted by horrible socialism, who deserves to be saved by the unyielding divine power of monogamous marriage. Like, was I supposed to hope that this man gets pardoned to go home and raise his children? Should I think he deserves a wife? Because the way everything is written after he leaves Kate's mansion is very on his side. Except that last paragraph, it is confusing that the book then ends focusing on the tragedy of Morris, a generally decent man who just saved Frank's life, and as a result is now left alone in a hopeless depression. I don't know what that's supposed to say. Now, there is a review of The One Woman in the October 1903 edition of the Bookman magazine. Quote, "Once a preacher, always a preacher." So it is not surprising that his new book turns out more a sermon than a novel. The man with a moral to enforce if he sets out to write a novel is going to show you that moral triumphant, life to the contrary notwithstanding, instead of giving you, as he ought, a few real people working out his idea as best they can, independently of his prejudiced guidance. Socialism is rampant in The One Woman, and socialism, with Mr. Dixon, means sexual license and the disruption of the family. The uneasy conviction grows from page to page that Mr. Dixon has not been fair to the belief he has set up to combat. To a mouthing, play-acting sort of fellow like this preacher hero, socialism may mean the license to leave his wife for the first handsome woman who takes his fancy, and then crawl back self-confessed a contemptible, cowardly murderer when the woman of his fancy avails herself of the same liberty. But socialism does not always mean this, and never merely this. Mr. Dixon has frankly libeled Herr Most and his fellow leaders of advanced thought. The most rabid anarchist of them all has never made his social tenets the excuse for such weak-spined blackguardism as characterizes the Reverend Frank Gordon. Since Mr. Dixon elected to put his preachment into the form of fiction, there must be a story to carry the weight of his rather cumbersome moralizing. Apart from its anti-socialist lessons, it is a good, healthy story. Mr. Dixon has none of the puling sentimentalism that takes fright at vigorous action and exciting situations. Mr. Dixon has, I am confident, tried honestly to write a readable novel. Being a preacher, he is not entirely to be blamed for his inability to divorce his story from an anti-socialist tract, without which it would be a very good reading of the blood and thunder variety. End quote. Edward Clark Marsh. Marsh really liked all of the super-contrived, mega-coincidental, oopsies, my wife and ex are on the same train, oh god, a horrible accident, sort of cheese drama. And you know what, if that's his trash, I'm happy for him. I wish Dixon had just written a ridiculous, corny cheating drama, or a dark murder tragedy about Frank ruining the lives of everyone around him, instead of whatever it is that we got. And then, I was so excited to find that around this time, the Bookman magazine started testing out a segment where they publish letters written by authors responding to the various criticisms they've received. And so I have the delight of sharing with you Mr. Dixon himself responding to critics of his work. So, The One Woman was published in August, usually a slow time of year, and so, quote, the chiefs of the reviewing staff were away on their vacations, and the book fell into the hands of the office boys for review, and in some cases the work evidently had to be done by the printer's devil. The severity of this office boy judgment on the morals of my book was something utterly unforeseen and appalling. One youngster, who signed the name of Dirk, writing for an alleged literary magazine, solemnly declared, its subject matter is, in toto, an ignorant flout at common decency. The thread of the story is not important, but it is, in its own way, vile. End quote. He did get some nice letters, which he quotes for us. Both of them call the novel sane and wholesome. Same words, same order, right next to each other. That's a little weird, Mr. Dixon. And even if I had liked the book, those are not the words I would use to describe it. Quote, but what do the opinions of doctors of divinity count before the fearful moral frown of a boy armed with the name of Dirk, crowned with the diadem of the measureless critical knowledge of youth, and seated on the throne of a 3-month-old magazine that was born with teeth, end quote. He's so mad. It's very funny. He tries to make a point about how all honest criticism is a product of personal point of view and bias from the critic, but that is also the power behind novels, and so the author shouldn't object, that would be hypocritical, and he's lucky if he receives intense critics. And then he whines about some more critics, and says he'll never forgive the man who once told him he used too many exclamation points, even if he was right. Quote, I have observed that where critics happen to know that I was once a clergyman, they are almost sure to complain of my preaching. This amuses me for 2 reasons. First, because I know that they invariably write that criticism before they read the book. And second, because all novelists are preachers, always have been and always will be. A novelist who has no faith to proclaim is simply a fool who has nothing to say and spoils tons of good paper trying to say it, end quote. Now, I think you just wrote a book that is incredibly blatantly preachy. There is a difference between conveying a message with a story and beating your reader over the head with a stick that you have engraved socialism bad into. Though, apparently he did get some critics saying the book was bad because it was pro-socialism, so maybe you never can be too obvious. I hope we get more author responses in the future. I enjoyed that way more than I should have. He was very dramatic. Personally, I think Dixon had the capacity as a writer to produce a book that was, tolerably decent, if kinda corny, and in need of some polish. There are individual scenes that have things about them that are sort of good. He sometimes captures messy human emotions better than some of the other authors I've covered here, but his messaging is overpowering. It's distracting, it's comically heavy-handed. And looking at his body of work, it seems like that is the only sort of thing he wanted to write. All that varies book to book is the target he preaches against. I guess it worked for some people because he made it a career. But that about covers it, so I hope I'll catch you in the next one. And in the meantime, you can catch me at YOBPod, YOBBPOD, on the various social media places. And for today's life advice from the past, don't ditch your boyfriend for the first hot blonde guy you meet. He'll ditch you for the first busty redhead he meets, and someone's gonna get killed about it.